we're going to be getting straight into it. Has everyone got Matthew 6? Is everyone there? We're going to be reading from verse 13, sorry. And this is what it says in Matthew 6, verse 13. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "Hey, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat." Or you need to hold that verse in your mind. They replied, "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, broke the loaves, then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The title of my message today is Get Into the Kitchen. Get into the kitchen. And what I want us to do, to spend our time together doing today, is unpacking the way in which Jesus wants to partner with you and I to feed the souls of the world around us. You see, in this series so far, we've spent time focusing on how we can refocus and reprioritize our own lives around looking to Jesus for food for our own souls. We've acknowledged in week 1 that it's only Jesus that can satisfy. We've looked at how we can fix our gaze on him to feed our souls in the day-to-day of our lives. And we've reminded ourselves last week that it's God that prepares a feast for every single one of us. God isn't just popping to Greg's on our behalf. He is preparing a feast, although I do love a Greg's. Anyway, while Jesus is the answer, Jesus is the hope of the world. Jesus is the bread of life. Jesus is the life-giving water. Jesus is the only one in whom we find salvation for our souls and meaning for our lives. When we become his disciples, he invites us into a life of participation and partnership in what he is doing. Now, I'm not sure how or when it happened, but in our house, it's become a bit of a thing that when either Ian or I are cooking, it is like a do not disturb sign goes up on the door. It's like, it's the one place that the 45 minutes in the day we can get a bit of uninterrupted peace and quiet. It's like, do not come into the kitchen when I am preparing dinner. We're in the zone, we're making something delicious, like you've never seen such good chicken nuggets and chips in your whole life. And it's gotten to the point where we actually get quite stressed if the other one of us tries to join in. Like if Ian tries to dive in halfway through a recipe, I'm like, get out. Step out the other side of that threshold. Do not come in to this kitchen. Does anyone know a cook like that who's like, get out of my kitchen? There's a few gazes going around. But yes, you know me. You all know me. So there we go. But here's the thing. This incredible story that we're looking at today in Matthew shows us that Jesus' invitation to his disciples is to get into the kitchen, to come alongside Jesus and get involved with what he is cooking up. Jesus' heart and design for you and I is that we wouldn't sit on the sidelines of what he is doing and watch like a spectator, but that we would fully participate in what he is doing. Now, there's so many things about this story that blow my mind, okay? Firstly, this passage starts with Jesus looking for some alone time after hearing the news that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been killed by Herod. Like, you can rewind a little bit in Matthew 14 and read that a little bit. It's like a dramatic story. Like, if you want some drama and some gore and some horribleness, just read the Bible, guys. It's full of it. But what this shows us is that Jesus Christ, fully God and fully man, sought time by himself to grieve and process what had just happened in solitude with God the Father. It blows my mind. Jesus felt pain. Jesus felt grief. And he models to us carrying that first and foremost to God. He shows us what it looks like to go and feed our soul well. The second thing that blows my mind about this story is the people's pursuit of Jesus. Like, Jesus moves, he makes one little step and the crowds are following after him. It's like these people are tuned in to everything that Jesus is doing. They are hungry for his teaching. They are hungry for his miracles. They are hungry for his presence. And the minute they hear that he's gone somewhere, they are in step following them. They've postured their lives to move where he moves. And it causes me to ask about the posture of my own heart. Like, how tuned into Jesus am I? How ready am I for Jesus to move? The third thing that blows my mind about this story is the fact that Jesus was willing to be interrupted. Like, Jesus would have had every right in the world to take some compassionate leave. Like, he's just heard his cousin has been beheaded and had his plate dished up on a platter to be presented to the king. Seriously, guys, the Bible's gross. But yet in verse 14, it says these words: when Jesus landed, saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. The original word for compassion here could actually be more accurately translated as his whole being was stirred to its depths. Like, it wasn't just like a little warm, fuzzy feeling like, oh, go on then. I'll take a break from my grief and I'll help you out. No, when Jesus saw the people, his whole being, the core of who he was, saw their need, felt their pain, like, was so moved to the depths of who he is that he was willing to be interrupted, to see each person for where they were at, to heal, to bring life, and to make right what was wrong. You know, there is no one that Jesus would rather be interrupted for than you. He sees you. He knows you, and he is moved to the depths of his being over you. So many things about this story that blow my mind. But the thing that I want to zoom in on for our time together this morning is what happens in verse 15 when the disciples rock up. See, when they arrive, I don't know where they've been, I don't know what they've been up to, who knows. But all the disciples see when they arrive is the need. They arrive in this situation. There's over 5,000 people listening to Jesus teach and minister and heal. And they're like, oh my goodness, how do we solve this problem? How do we sort this situation out? And fair enough, I'm with the disciples on this one. Like, I am a chronic over caterer. Like, if you've been to my house for tea, you know if there's going to be 4 of us, there's going to be enough food for at least 10 people. Like, we had a running joke over Christmas that I just had this ever-replenishing supply of cheese. Like, every time people came round, it would just magically reappear. I inherited this trait from my mother. I believe it's genetic. And I'm working on it, guys. I am working on it. Like, my ultimate fear is not having enough food to supply everyone who is in my house. But I've got to say that even for me, looking at a crowd of 5,000 plus people, wondering how on earth to get them all fed would seem like a bit much. It doesn't matter how many trips you do to Asda, that is going to be a difficult situation to solve. And I find it really interesting that in the face of this need and under these circumstances, the disciples' instinct is to send everyone away. Let them sort themselves out. This is too big for us. This is too much. We can't possibly solve this problem, so everyone needs to go and fend for themselves. But let's revisit what Jesus says in verse 16. He says, no, they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. A little bit further down in verse 19, it says, Jesus gave the bread and the fish to the disciples, and then the disciples gave them to the people. Now, for me, this is where we come to the most mind-blowing part of this story. You see, Jesus could have easily solved the problem by himself. Like, I don't know, he could have made manna fall down from heaven, like we saw in Exodus with the Israelites. He could have spoken dinner into existence, and chicken nuggets and chips would have just sprouted up of the ground before people. He could have even miraculously taken everyone's hunger away. Actually, there's no more need for dinner. There's your tummy filled right there and then. But it blows my mind that instead, he chose his disciples, who, if we're honest, were being quite small-minded, were lacking in faith, we're definitely erring on the side of ungenerosity, but it's those people that he invites to get into the kitchen to participate in what he was about to do. And as we wrap up this month's series, where we've been thinking all about how we feed our own souls well, I believe that Jesus wants to invite each and every one of us into the kitchen to participate in feeding the souls of those around us. I want you to know today that Jesus wants you in the kitchen. Maybe not literally. I know some of you, I've seen some of the way you guys cook. No, I'm joking. But let's think about the disciples a little bit more in this scenario for a moment. As we've said, they don't exactly rock up full of faith or compassion. They're tired, they're fearful, they've heard what's happened to John the Baptist, and they're like, goodness me, are they going to be coming for Jesus next? What is going on? All they see is problem after problem. Not to mention the fact that all they had with them was 5 loaves and 2 fish. Barely anything in the light of what was needed. And yet, still, Jesus includes them and what was in their hand in what he was doing. He didn't have to use them, but he wanted to. He didn't have to use the disciples, but he wanted to count them in. You know, sometimes we can count ourselves out of what Jesus is doing. Oh, I don't know if I have enough faith for that. I don't know, if I'm honest, if I care enough about that situation. I don't know if I have enough resource in my hand. But what's really important to know is that Jesus invites you to come as you are and offer what you have to join in with what he is doing. You don't need to fully understand. We just need to receive from him and follow his lead. Jesus gave the bread to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the people. I wonder what would happen if you spent some time reflecting on these 2 questions every single day. Number 1, what has Jesus put in my hand? What is it? It might be time. It might be a word of encouragement. It might be a resource. It might be a skill that you have. It might be a way that you see the world. What is it that Jesus has put in my hand? Number 2, what is it he is asking me to do? You see, Jesus didn't require the disciples to do anything that he wasn't asking them to. Jesus is always leading us. Jesus is always guiding us. Jesus is always prompting us. What is it that he's asking us to do? In a few moments, we're going to move into some time where we're going to share communion and we're going to go back into worship and have some ministry. But just before we do, I'd just love to share some quick thoughts on what it is that Jesus is actually cooking up in the kitchen and inviting us to join in on. Number one, what Jesus is cooking up is to be enjoyed. It's a good meal that Jesus is cooking. I find it really interesting in verse 19, it says Jesus directed the people to sit down on the grass. Like this wasn't a grab and go snack that Jesus was providing for the people. This was a proper sit down meal. This was Jesus like laying the table. He's got the nice candles on. He's got a good playlist in the background. This is Jesus inviting people not to rush through being in his presence, but to come and sit. And when we sit down for a dinner, we want to enjoy it. We want to relish the moment. We want to step into everything that it is. When we participate in what Jesus is doing, we want to know we're bringing a feast to the world around us. What we have, what we carry, what Jesus has put on the inside of each one of us is a feast. And I know we're nearly at the end of February, but in some part of my mind is still a little bit in New Year mode. Is anyone else there? Is anyone else not quite sure where the last 2 months have gone? But one of my decisions at the start of the year was, God, I want this year to be full of joy. Like I'm going to decide that this year is going to be full of joy. And I felt like when I made that I wrote it down in my journal, I felt like God was like, yes, I am to be enjoyed. I am to be full of life, full of laughter, full of fun. And that is what we have to offer to the world around us. Would we take the time to sit? Would we take the time to listen? Would we take the time to share? The time to laugh? The time to enjoy Jesus and share him along the way? The second thing about what Jesus is cooking up. What Jesus is cooking up is to satisfy. Verse 20, really simple. It says, they all ate and were satisfied. No one had any left in either their main tummy or their pudding tummy. Everyone was full. Yes, that is a real biological fact, I'm sure. But with Jesus, this is something I really feel like God's been speaking to my own heart about lately. With Jesus, there is always more than enough. This wasn't the first time that the disciples had seen Jesus miraculously provide something. His very first miracle was turning water into wine at a wedding where they had run out. But what he did in that moment meant there was more than enough. Even though the disciples had seen this with their own eyes, even though they had seen Jesus provide time after time, they didn't bring the expectation for Jesus to be able to do it again into this situation. They were like, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix it? There's no one around here who has the ability to miraculously multiply things. What is going to happen? But participating in what Jesus is doing is always a good reminder that in him there is more than enough. While it involved the disciples giving initially what they did have in their hand over to Jesus, the result was that when it was given back to them, everyone ate and was satisfied. And I just really sense today that the Holy Spirit wants to break off a fear of lack in our lives. Like when we look around at the world, all that we're hearing in the news, the supermarkets are running out of tomatoes. There's supply chain issues left, right, and centre. I know for so many people are devastated because they can't get tomatoes this week. And I know that's just a small thing, and there's bigger things at play. I know that as a country, in our lifetime, we've maybe never been under such a significant financial pressure. I know in my experience, I've never had to think so carefully about what resources we're allocating where and how we're stewarding what God has put in our hands. But I really feel like today that the Spirit of God wants to come and break off a fear of lack. Maybe it's like a generational fear of lack. It's like growing up, your family was always in lack, and now your expectation is that you will always be in lack. I feel like God wants to come and break that off our lives, and we're going to pray for that in a couple of moments' time. But the final thing that I just want to highlight about what Jesus is cooking up in the kitchen. Number 3, it's available in every circumstance. Let's come back full circle, right to the start of this story. All of this crazy miracle where 5,000 men and the women and children are fed, fully satisfied. All of this is taking place against the backdrop of grief, pain, and fear. Like, it's not like Jesus is just kind of able to set all of that aside and pretend like that's not happening. But all of it takes place in spite of what Jesus and the disciples are experiencing emotionally, spiritually, mentally. Against all of that, Jesus says, verse 16, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. You know, for us as individuals, let's apply this principle to each one of our own lives for a second. Circumstances do not need to make you go away from Jesus' presence. No matter what happens in our lives, no matter what challenges we face, no matter what might be going on in our workplaces, in our families, in our health, in the situations that we face on a day-to-day basis, there is no need to step away from continual communion and fellowship with Jesus. Why would we look anywhere else other than the loving, compassionate, powerful presence of Jesus, who is more than able to meet every need? In turn, there should be no circumstance in our lives that would require us to turn people away, because there is no circumstance that Jesus is unable to provide for you and that person in. Now, what I'm about to say, I say in love, I say with caution, and I do say with the invitation for godly wisdom to be applied. But in our moment of history, our culture is particularly focused, particularly celebratory of self-care. And I don't know about you, my social media feed is full of adverts of things like, go on, have this thing. You deserve it. Treat yourself. Like, you need this break. You need this coffee. You need this, whatever it is. For some reason, I always seem to get an advert for that earwax cleaner that like has a camera on the end. However you self-care, guys. I'm not here to judge. But our life, the world is full of like this constant messaging of look after number one. Look after you first and foremost. Now, don't get me wrong. Looking after yourself is good. Like, rest is good. We are big advocates of taking a Sabbath one day a week where we are switching off from work and we're saying, God, this day belongs to you, and we are resting and we are delighting in you. Doing things that refuel your soul, that you love to do, whatever it is good. Taking care of your health and well-being is so important. But in a worldly context, away from Jesus, these things are like focused in a way which tends to kind of make ourselves curve in on ourselves a little bit. It's like, actually, nothing else matters apart from my own well-being. Nothing else matters apart from how I'm feeling right now. Nothing else matters apart from where my own soul is at. Now, life with Jesus is all about looking after our own souls well, but being completely willing to be interrupted to feed someone else's. Because when we do, we can have confidence that Jesus is more than able to provide for everyone. Now, you'll notice I use the word interrupted here, because if you carry on reading in Matthew 6, what happens immediately after the feeding of the 5,000 is that Jesus sends everyone away, the crowds, the disciples, and he finally gets his time of solitude in prayer with the Father. I'm not talking about neglecting our own soul for the sake of others, but I'm talking about being willing to be interrupted. Will we make room at the table of our lives for people to come and taste and see how good Jesus is? Trusting that as we do, Jesus is more than able to meet your needs too. One final note before we land. As I was praying over this message last night, I felt led to add this little point in. That for some of you here, actually, your whole life is about making room for other people. Like you are one of those people where nothing is too big or too small. If there's a need, you'll fill it. If there's a phone call, you'll answer it. If there's a crisis, you're in the mix trying to sort it out. But I just sense that Jesus would say to you today that actually, he loves your heart. He loves that. But would you join in with him in what he's doing? He would say that you are not the fixer, he is. You are not the healer, he is. You are not the provider, he is. He wants you to be making room, but would you do so in step with him? Before diving headlong into a situation that needs solving, actually, hey Jesus, where are you at work in this? Jesus, what are you putting in my hand right now that you want me to minister? Would it be your life, Jesus, that I'm ministering as I step in to this situation? We feed our souls so that we're ready to minister to others. The invitation to us all today is, will we join Jesus in the kitchen? We don't need to have all the answers. We don't need to fully understand how it's all going to work. We just need to follow his lead. Would we live our lives asking, what is in my hand today? And who can I feed today? Who can I encourage? Who can I give practical help to? Who can I give a lift to the supermarket to? Who could I pray for? Who could I get a word of encouragement for? Let's be a church that chooses to get into the kitchen with Jesus.